Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Pamela Schaff. I'm the director of the HEAL Humanities, Ethics, Art, and Law program and the director of Keck's Master of Science in Narrative Medicine program. Thank you for joining us today for today's event with Dr. Emily Silverman, The Power of the Voice, Storytelling, Medicine, and the Nocturnists. As we gather here today, I'd like to open by acknowledging that USC was built on the sacred land of the Tongva Nation. We honor the Tongva and all Indigenous people, past, present, and future, and their continued survival and contributions to our society. We also honor the legacy of the African diaspora and recognize that this country would not exist without the free enslaved labor of Black people. We share these acknowledgements to pay respect to the original caretakers of this land, to raise awareness about histories that are too often erased or forgotten, and to affirm our commitment to social change. Today's event is the final offering in our 22-23 Healing Voices lecture series. I'd like to thank Visions and Voices for the generous award that has enabled us to bring you today's event and this series, and David Delgado, Marie Velez, Daria Yudakovsky, and their entire team for their support in helping us deliver our events. I also want to thank our AV team, who, even with today's difficulties, exhibit always a professionalism and expertise, and we're grateful to them, and to Paige Tonks for her outstanding work in organizing all aspects of this event. Finally, I want to thank my faculty colleagues, Erica Wright, Sabrina Darrington, and Ron Bennery. And I'm going to turn over the microphone now to Dr. Wright, who will introduce Dr. Silverman. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to make this as quick as possible. I'm Erica Wright, Associate Director of Keck School of Medicine's HEAL program and the Master's of Science in Narrative Medicine. I want to acknowledge, first and foremost, our Year 3 medical students in the audience. This event is part of the intercession curriculum. So welcome and congratulations on finishing your clinical rotations. I want to say, it was a student who introduced us to Emily Silverman 3 years ago around springtime to help us think through the power of stories. And so, as Dr. Schaff said, this is our final event in the series of Healing Voices lecture. As with our previous speakers, we are continuing to look at the importance of stories in medicine, whether it's during a clinical encounter or as part of your own self-care. We hosted Dr. Sayantani Dasgupta in September, and she discussed the importance of cultivating narrative humility and embracing a sense of curiosity about other perspectives. Our conversation with Dr. Michelle Harper in November spoke to her personal experiences with racism in medicine and her commitment to advocating for her most vulnerable patients. We are thrilled to have Dr. Silverman here to talk to us about how stories and storytelling can help us explore the topic of shame in medicine. And we just think today's session will resonate in many ways and will speak to the challenges inherent in your medical school experience and provide a framework for understanding the complex emotional journey you all are on and reflecting on what it means to do this kind of learning. Dr. Silverman is an internal medicine physician, assistant volunteer professor of medicine at University of California, San Francisco, and founder and host of the Nocturnists. She has many awards, but I'm going to let you hear from her now. So, take it away.
It's so wonderful to be with you today. Thank you, Pamela and Erica, for inviting me. And it's great to be in LA. It's such a diverse place, such a creative place. And there's great energy in this room. So thanks for having me. I hear many of you are third-year med students, approaching the end of your third year. So you've really been through it. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that. I still remember my third year of medical school, and there's so much transformation that happens in that year. Personal identity formation and professional identity formation to get academic with the language, but a lot of change. So I just want you to know that you're doing great, and I'm cheering you on, and just wanted to honor you for a moment. All right, so raise your hand if you're familiar with the Nocturnists. And raise your hand if you're not really familiar with the Nocturnists. Okay, great. So we have a split audience. Over the next 40 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about who I am and what I do, what the Nocturnist is and how it came to be and how it works, and then settle in and focus on our most recent documentary podcast series, which is called Shame in Medicine, The Lost Forest. We'll talk a little bit about shame, and then we'll wrap it up and take some questions. So let's see if we can get this to work. Okay. Does anyone know what this is? Yeah, I heard. Black hole. So this is the first photo ever taken of a black hole, and I like to start my talk with this image because I feel like many good things in the world are born from destruction and annihilation, and that's true of the Nocturnists as well. So just a little bit about me. I've wanted to be a doctor since I was a little kid. I was running around the playground saying, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a doctor, and just had always dreamed of going into medicine. And then went to medical school, and those were actually really happy and playful years for me. It kind of felt like a kid in a candy store, just learning so much. And then I went to residency. I came out to UCSF for my residency in internal medicine. And about halfway through residency, I really hit a wall. And I think what I realized is that I was just deeply unhappy. And that was confusing to me because I had wanted this my whole life. And suddenly here I was. And I realized I was spending more time with computers than with people. I felt rushed and felt really disconnected from my own humanity, my own creativity. I felt a little bit like a shell of myself and just was kind of facing an existential crisis. And I thought at the moment that maybe it was just a me thing, but then I realized it's actually a national thing. We have a crisis of clinician burnout. That was true before COVID, and of course COVID made it worse, and so that's a separate conversation, but I was feeling that, and my act of rebellion was to create the Nocturnist. That was the way that I coped with this feeling. And so this is January 2016. What ended up happening was a friend of mine invited me to see a live taping of The Moth, which if any of you are familiar, it's a live show and radio program on NPR where people stand on stage one by one and they tell real, true stories. It's a very ancient thing, a very primal thing, this act of storytelling. And I just remember walking out of that theater feeling totally electrified and feeling like somehow this is what I was missing in medicine, and just having this intuition that that's what we needed as a community. And so I did something which was very uncharacteristic of me, which is I got in my car on my days off in residency and started driving around San Francisco and going into little theaters and announcing that I was a doctor and I was going to do a storytelling night and how much would it cost to rent this theater. This is the first show. It was $90 to rent this living room in a shared Victorian mansion in San Francisco, and you can see some of my colleagues there in the audience. The theme for this show was promises, and there was no scripting, no coaching, just totally off the cuff, and it was just really special. And after it ended, people came over and said, when is the next one? And 4 years later, we sold out the Brava Theater in the Mission District of San Francisco. And then in January 2020, right before the pandemic hit, we had a sold out show of 700 people at the Yerba Buena Center of the Arts in San Francisco. So I want you to imagine walking into this huge theater and looking around, and there's doctors and nurses and med students. And in our case, it was people from UCSF and Stanford and Kaiser and Marin and South Bay and Oakland and Highland, and just a really amazing community of people. And I think the fact that we were able to fill these theaters with virtually no advertising, really, is because what we were doing spoke to this hunger in the healthcare community to be engaging with our work and with ourselves through this more humanistic and narrative lens, which is so often stripped out in the current medical system, which really prioritizes machine-like efficiency over human connection. Along the way, we had our podcast spin-off, The Nocturnists, and as it turned out, it was really good that we had that, because when the pandemic hit, we couldn't do live shows anymore, and we really had to lean into the podcast. And at the time, it was a bummer, because I love live shows, but as often happens, you adapt and conform to whatever circumstances are thrown your way. And we decided in the throes of the pandemic that we needed to continue to serve our community, and we put out a call for audio diaries In the months of March, April, and May of 2020, we received several hundred audio diaries from people around the United States, which was really exciting because our audience, was sort of a nervous system throughout the entire country that we just had to send that impulse down the nervous system, and we got all this response. We had built up the audience already from our podcast. Got all these audio diaries. We're really fortunate to be able to trap that moment in amber, produce the Stories from a Pandemic audio series, which was later archived at the United States Library of Congress as a historic record, which we're really proud of. This audio format, the audio diary format, it's really different for us. And after George Floyd was killed that summer, we did a similar series, audio diary format, Voices from Around the Nation, that was called Black Voices in Healthcare, and that was hosted by my friend, Dr. Ashley McMullen at UCSF, and produced by Dr. Kimberly Manning at Emory, two amazing Black women physicians who are passionate about the medical humanities. So that was our second experiment with the audio diary format. And then that brings us to the most recent program, which is Shame in Medicine. And I have an audio clip. Before I say anything about this project, I'm going to try to play this clip. But before I hit play, I encourage you to just sit back, relax, maybe even close your eyes and just take in this audio clip. It's only about 2 minutes long.
One of those events that you live in fear of as a resident, as a physician, where you and everyone around you, and there were a lot of people in the room, know that something has just gone terribly wrong. And it's almost like time stopped. I feel incredibly uncomfortable and incredibly exposed. And what I see are the eyes of the people standing around me. And I feel the judgment. And the only thing I know to do in that moment, some sort of subconscious primitive impulse, is to leave the room.
A couple years ago, I got an email from a philosopher in the United Kingdom named Luna Dolezal. Luna had been listening to the Nocturnists for years, and she wanted to know if I'd ever noticed that the emotion of shame was coming up again and again in these stories. I had not noticed this, but I went back and listened to several of our old episodes, and I realized that she was right. I started to see shame everywhere in medicine. And what was stranger was that nobody was talking about it. And so Luna and I decided to team up with Dr. Will Bynum from Duke University to investigate this incredibly powerful emotion and how it manifests in medical culture.
Your brain tells you the most unkind and outrageous things that are totally ridiculous. But the only way that you find out how ridiculous you are treating yourself is when you talk to your colleagues about their own experiences and you realize how universal some of these shame experiences are.
He presented it in a way that said, you should have known this, you missed something big. And at that moment, I felt my stomach drop and felt like I wanted to sink into the floor.
When I think about this, the words just sort of go away. It's almost like there's a protective mechanism that's tripped off that says, hey, that's not something that you should be talking about.
And why did I beat myself up over it so much? For once, I went from complete suffocation to now I could actually take my first few breaths.
Shame in Medicine, The Lost Forest, is a 10-episode audio documentary series that premieres next week. See you then. So that gives you a flavor of the project. And what I said in the clip is true, that I just got this email out of the blue from this woman, a philosopher in the United Kingdom, Luna Dolezal, who has this big grant to study shame in medicine. Later, I learned that even though there's quite a bit of research on the topic of shame in general, there's actually very little research out there about shame in medicine, even though our profession is mired in shame in terms of its culture. To the extent that there is research on the topic, a lot of it is Luna's research and Will's research, and so they became the two shame experts that we worked with for this series. And similar to what we did for the Stories from a Pandemic series and the Black Voices series, couldn't do live shows. we put out a call for shame stories and received hundreds of clips. We didn't say what type of shame story or throw out any suggestions for themes or anything. We just said, tell us your shame story, and looked at what rolled in. And I think we were all kind of floored by the fact that so much material rolled in. And I think that's just a testament to the fact that, you know, we are an organization that was created by healthcare for healthcare. We're not really journalists. Like, I'm a doctor. I've been through the training. It is a bit of a shared experience. And so I think there was a level of trust there that that allowed people to just take the leap and record their shame story on their phone and just click send and send it to the ether to a team of anonymous strangers. In some ways, we heard this from the people who did send in their stories, that it's actually easier to send it to a group of anonymous strangers than it is to talk about it with your colleague next to you at work. So maybe there's something there too. But we received all these audio clips and then embarked on the very difficult creative project of sorting through them and trying to figure out how to group them and how to turn this into a narrative project. And I'm going to get into that, into what were the themes that came out and how did we organize this material. But before we do, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about shame. And by the way, this artwork was put together by an amazing illustrator in Italy, actually, Beppe Conti. He's a collage artist, and we were just thrilled with the art that he made for this. So I didn't really know that much about shame. You hear the word shame and you kind of think you know. But Will and Luna just taught me so much about this emotion. And I remember thinking to myself, I wish that when I was a medical student, somebody explained this to me. And so here I am, explaining it to you. And there's a few reasons why I think it's important to understand what it is and how it works, and to have that shared vocabulary, because it can actually be really empowering when you're having a shame experience and you don't know what it is, you don't have the words to describe it, to be able to attach that label to it and then understand how to work with it and how to grow from that experience in a way that's constructive, as opposed to in a way that's mired in secrecy and isolation and it can be corrosive, is a really empowering thing. And so again, I wish that I had had this information when I was in training, early in training. So shame is a pain response. So shame is an emotional experience that we have when we feel like our social bonds are threatened. So let's say you do or you say something that is deemed shameful. Shame as an emotion is like a pain signal or a warning response, almost like touching a hot stove and pulling back, but instead of it being your physical body, it's the collective body, it's the social body. And so it's a signal from the social collective that you've overstepped a boundary, you've transgressed in some way, you've deviated in some way. This is an extremely primal emotion that probably evolved to keep us in the herd when we were far earlier in our evolution. And because it's so primal, it's actually not really logical. It can be hard to talk yourself out of. It's really an emotion that is grounded in survival. And so that's the first thing to know. Next is that shame is what we call in emotion theory a self-conscious emotion. So I didn't know this, but there are emotions like shame and guilt and pride that are self-conscious emotions. So that means that to experience the emotion, it requires that you see yourself through the eyes of someone else. Now, this can be a real person or a real group, or this can even be an imagined person or an imagined group or an internalized voice. You don't even have to agree with this external observer to feel shame, but there does have to be that external component. And so one thing that's really interesting about shame, as opposed to other emotions, is that it serves as this bridge between the individual and the personal and the social and the collective. It's that emotion is bridging us and them, or me and us, maybe is a better way to put it. There are other emotions like happiness and sadness and anger that do not need this external observer component. And so that's what makes shame a self-conscious emotion. And this is actually what got Luna interested in studying the emotion of shame, because she's very interested in culture and in social anthropology. And so this emotion was a way into that for her. So let's talk about the phenomenology of an acute shame experience. As medical students, you've probably learned a lot about the different signatures of symptoms. So for chest pain, maybe you learn, radiating to both arms, or, radiating up the jaw, a dull ache, elephant on the chest. Maybe for pancreatitis, you learn that it's boring through the back kind of a pain. These are the illness scripts or stereotypes of the pain. Acute shame experiences have a script too. When you ask people to describe an acute shame experience, there's a few themes that come up. One is this feeling of being under a spotlight, that you're highly visible or conspicuous, that everybody is staring at you, you're under the light, everything else is dark. And the physical body agrees with this notion. Blood rushes to the face, rushes to the cheeks, maybe you feel some warmth there, so you are more visible in a way. There's also a downward movement that happens, so there's sort of slumping of the shoulders, a feeling of wanting to disappear or melt into the ground. Some people report a feeling of time stopping. And all of this embodied sensation is associated with an intense feeling of self-disgust and unworthiness. And these experiences are so powerful that often we can relive them days later, even years later. There are some people who say, I had a shame experience a few years ago, and when I think about it, if I really think about it, it feels almost as fresh as the day that it happened. And because these experiences are so potent and so unpleasant, they're very effective drivers of behavior. And so some people call shame the emotion of social control. Shame is a way that you can get people to do things because people will do almost anything to avoid shame. You may intuit this when you think about when people list their biggest fears. It's like death is number 2, and number 1 is like public speaking. Because if you mess up, it's kind of like death. It's like a social death. That's what shame is about. Another thing to know about shame is that it's context specific. So it's not, a monolith. The way that shame is expressed in you is dependent on where you come from, on your background, on your culture, and this can come up for people when they're context switching. Maybe they go from one country to another, or one profession to another, maybe a different religious community to another, things like that. And so, what's shameful for me may not even register for you, and vice versa. And so that's something to know, that it can be very individualized, and these cultures can collide differently for different people. And then the other concept that I think is important to talk about is this idea of chronic shame or shame proneness. Also something Will and Luna taught me about, which is this idea that if you've had enough acute shame experiences over the course of your life, you may develop chronic shame, which is sort of like a posture that you adopt. You move through the world just kind of expecting to be shamed. And that can influence the way that you respond in different situations. There may even be situations where there's a stimulus that maybe others would consider as a normal stimulus, and then you have an exaggerated response because you have this shame proneness. And in that case, people sometimes develop habits to avoid feeling shame, and so maybe they withdraw, or maybe they lash out. Will and Luna and I have talked a lot about what type of person does the medical profession attract? And I'm sure it's many different types of people. We're all different. Speaking for myself, I find that a lot of my friends in medical school were achievement-oriented, perfectionists, and just looking back at our childhoods and thinking about, what are we showing up with before day 1 of medical school in terms of our shame proneness, and then how does medical culture reinforce some of that shame proneness? So what did we do with all these stories, and what was the goal of putting together this series? And I think it was multi-pronged. So first, as Luna says in the audio clip, shame is the elephant in the room. Everybody kind of knows it's there, but nobody really wants to talk about it. And so let's just shine a light right on it and talk about it and offer people a forum where they can, express their shame story and do that communally and collectively. And as it turns out, that process alone of talking about shame itself is an intervention. Something really interesting about how shame works is that it really thrives and grows in the dark, but if you throw sunlight on it, it disinfects a bit. So just the act of talking about it, doing the storytelling itself is an intervention. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Next is to develop a shared vocabulary. So like I said, let's know what shame is, let's know what shame isn't, and then we can think about tools for how to manage it. Let's use shame as a lens through which to examine medical culture. So one thing Luna talks a lot about is that if you want to understand the culture of an organization, let's say, or a group or a place, just look for the shame, and that will help you find the contours of that culture and kind of how it's configured and what's acceptable and what's not, and so on and so forth. And so what is medical culture? What is acceptable and what's not? And what is the shape of it? And then let's start conversations about change. So once we have a sense for what the culture is, thinking about, okay, well, what do we want to keep? What do we like? And what do we want to ditch? What do we want to change? What do we want to build? And so that conversation is not something that we tackled in the series because we don't pretend to have the answers, but I think we hope that this series serves as a springboard for conversations like that. So the stories. I do just want to take a few minutes to go through some of the themes that came up and touch on them briefly so you can know what kind of material we're dealing with. Obviously, there's limited time, and if you want to learn more, you can go ahead and listen to the episodes. We'll just go through that one by one and then close out and then take some questions at the end. So how to organize these stories. So some of these episodes came together very easily. And some of them were on themes that we expected to come up. So, for example, I always knew from the beginning of this project that we were going to have an episode about medical error. Because when I think about shame in medicine, I think about, our profession is so high stakes. We're making life and death decisions all the time. And so how do you avoid shame in a setting like that? Can you even avoid shame in a setting like that? Should you avoid shame in a setting like that, when every decision you make is so high stakes? And so we did receive stories from people about mistakes, misdiagnoses, procedural errors. We have a really heart-wrenching story from an interventional radiologist who talks about putting a needle in someone to do a liver biopsy. The anatomy was very complicated and ended up nicking the heart, the pericardium, and causing a hemopericardium, and the shame associated with that. So that was an episode that I expected. Another episode that I expected was the episode Indoctrination, which is about shame in learning. So many of you just finished your third year. You may have gotten a flavor. I don't know, maybe things have changed. I was in medical school back in 2010, but that shame can sometimes be wielded in a clinical setting as a teaching tool. This term pimping, which I think all of us probably agree that word should be phased out. But what is pimping? And what is the difference between pimping, asking questions, quizzing publicly for the purpose of humiliating someone? What's the difference between that and creating an environment of psychological safety where you can ask questions of your learners and probe them and assess where they are and then help them move along their growth curve? And so really thinking about this idea of shame in learning. As you're moving a learner from pre-med student to med student to resident to attending, what role, if at all, is there for shame? So that was another episode that I expected. The episode that I did not expect was our episode on shame and exams and testing. So I thought maybe we would include some of those stories in our shame and learning episode, but we received so many stories about the shame associated with exams and testing that we gave it its own episode. And I could go on and on about that episode alone, but if you take a listen, I think for me, it really helped me understand the emotional ramifications of the way that we think about standardized testing and shelves in the MCAT and step one, especially step one. Have you taken step one? Yeah, so that's behind you. So that was another unexpected episode. And then I'll just go through a couple others. So one of them was shame in litigation. So as med students, have you ever thought about it? What if I get sued? Raise your hand if you've thought about it. Be honest. Okay. Raise your hand if you're like, oh, actually, I haven't really thought about that. Yeah. admittedly, when I was a med student, I actually didn't really think about it, which in retrospect, oh, maybe I should have thought more about that. But yeah, a lot of people, they have no idea how to think about that, how to prepare. And so we had a whole episode about shame in litigation that traces the story of an emergency medicine doctor in Rhode Island who saw a patient in the ER, and then a year later is notified that she's being sued. She's the sole defendant, $28 million, and then embarks on this 12-year odyssey where she goes to trial once, ends up winning, and then the verdict is overturned, goes to trial again several years later. She was pregnant with her third trial when the trial started. By the time the second trial ended, her children were grown, and what it's like to live with this in the house and how to cope with the shame associated with being sued. She describes it, kind of like scarlet letter. So that's something I think that we need to be talking about as clinicians. So those are some of the themes. Others, we have a lot of stuff about shame and identity, people feeling like they need to hide aspects of themselves that the profession won't accept, shame and mental health. We have this idea of the ideal doctor. What is the ideal doctor? Who's ideal? And so those are some of the themes that bubbled up as we sifted through this material. Again, we could have organized these stories in so many different ways, but this is the way that it shook out. And so I hope you'll take some time to listen, to check it out. It's heavy stuff, so pace yourself. And then before we open it up for a Q&A, I just wanted to let you know that in addition to the art, which that's what I call it, these 10 podcast episodes, I call it the art, we wanted to put the art to work. So rather than just have the episodes published and out in the world, how do we put that art to work and get that to penetrate the medical community? And so some of that is me coming here and giving talks like this and alerting you to the existence of this material. But there's a lot of other ways that we can break open this topic of shame and talk about it. And so on our website, there's an Engage page where you can download facilitator toolkits, discussion guides for each episode, things of that nature, so that if you want, you can start a conversation in your own community. And maybe that's in an informal way. Maybe it's you and some friends sitting at a coffee shop, or maybe it's a formal way. Maybe it's a noon conference or some kind of workshop. But I do think that the more that we dive into this topic as a profession, the better the profession will be, not just for our sake, but also for our patients, because having a workforce that's walking around mired in shame has huge implications for patient care, patient outcomes, patient safety. So that's all I have for you today. I hope that you'll cook up some good questions and that we can open a dialogue. And just wanted to say thank you again for having me. It's really a thrill to be here, and just so much respect for all of you at the beginning of this journey. And take care.
Thank you so much. We have microphones over here, and if you have questions in Zoom land, we can answer those. So don't be ashamed to ask a question.
Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
Thank you, Dr. Silverman. I recently discovered the Nocturnist podcast just a couple months ago, and I direct the pre-health advising office at the main campus. I work with a lot of pre-med students, and I wonder if you have any suggestions for how to start this conversation with the younger generation of future health professionals, where I often see kind of those seeds of shame starting. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's a great question. Dr. Will Bynum, who is at Duke and studies shame experiences medical learners, I was asking him about his research because he started by researching residents and interviewing them and doing qualitative research, what is the experience of residents? And he realized this stuff with the residents, that started in med school. So then he started to interview med students, and he was like, oh, no, this is all started pre-med. And so like I said, it just goes back and back and back. And so just so great to have this resource and to be able to intervene as early as possible. And I think what it really boils down to is just self-knowledge and looking at yourself and saying, all right, like, is there any shame proneness there? And if so, where might that come from and what that might be related to? And how do I want to carry that forward? How do I want to be conscious of that as I move through this profession? It can be a brutal journey. We all have stories about being shamed, being yelled at, or it's funny, the shame and litigation episode, when she got the letter that she was being sued, 28 million, sole defendant, one of the first things she did, and she says this in the episode, is she walked into her boss's office and she said, I quit. She said, I'm never practicing medicine again. And he said, just come back for 2 weeks. And if you can keep going for 2 weeks, and then you want to stop. And so just thinking about something like that, like how do we create a workforce where, a challenge like that comes up, and then there isn't this impulse to just like quit and drop it all together. Like, how do we build some of that shame resilience is so important. And there's just so much that's ripe for research here. There's things about the intergenerational aspect of shame. So this attitude of, I'm the older physician and this is how it was done when I was your age, and so that's how I'm going to do it with you. And so how do we look at that? And how it cuts across gender, for example. So we learned 75 to 80% of the stories we received in the first batch were from women. And Will talks a lot about shame in men and how talking about shame potentially is especially shameful. And so that need and that research area. So there's just so much to be done. But I think just starting the conversation early and really examining ourselves and then thinking about how to move through, navigate this environment, because the environment isn't going to change overnight. So we need to be able to build some of that resilience within ourselves while we simultaneously work on changing the environment.
Thank you very much for being here and for talking to us. I have a question. I'm going to pick this up because I'm tall. I have a question as we're sort of like embarking on the journey of preparing our residency applications. I think that's a process that is like necessarily very self-conscious. So that is sort of baked in. We need to be assessing ourselves in some ways compared to our peers. So I guess I'm wondering, like, what are best practices for navigating a process like that is so introspective in a way that is like healthy and honest and mutually supportive of each other?
Thank you. That's a great question. There's so many ways to tackle that. I mean, one lens is through like competition and kind of how to build yourself up and try to distinguish yourself from your peers. But I think there's another layer underneath there, which is like how real to get in your residency applications. And we talk about this in the finale of the series. Brene Brown really popularized this idea of vulnerability as strength and sort of the virtues of sharing and opening and being vulnerable. And I think there's a lot in there that is true. But I think it's also true that some people don't have the privilege of being vulnerable. There are certain settings where being open and vulnerable in that way isn't safe, could lead to abuse, retaliation, for example. There's a wonderful community called Docs with Disabilities, and it's a group of physicians and students who are living with disabilities, and they talk a lot about disclosure. So, should I disclose my disability or not, and that choice, and it's a very personal choice. Because on the one hand, we want to show ourselves and each other and the world that, a physician can come in all sorts of, shapes and sizes and abilities. But on the other hand, there are real ramifications that can come out of disclosure. And so how do we balance that intent to open and share and change with the very real need to protect oneself? And I think that's a constant negotiation that we have to be having, and it's very personal. And we just navigate it best we can in the comfort of our homes and friends and family and mentors and things like that.
Thank you for so beautifully articulating this emotion that I think a lot of us have experienced. I guess one of the things I think about is this tension between this expectation that we're supposed to be the finished product at every stage of our training,
and the reality that most of us are learners and we're going to make mistakes. So I was wondering, like in your experience, what are some best practices to like ensure the psychological safety of trainees, as you alluded to?
Yeah, we forget that sometimes, don't we? Like, you'll be a student and someone will be like, hey, tell me, what are the 6 different types of pulmonary hypertension, or, something like that. And you don't know it, or maybe you forgot, or you haven't learned it yet, and then you feel like a failure, when in reality, like, you are learning. There is a growth curve, and you might be here, or you might be there, or your curve may look like this, and someone else's may look like this, and we're all on a different journey. And so, yeah, how do we acknowledge that? I do think that we forget that, and we expect ourselves to kind of emerge fully formed and fully functional, and that's just not the case. And I think that feeds into this pervasive myth, this myth of the physician God, this myth of the physician hero, this myth of the physician robot, this idea that we take care of people, but we don't have bodies, we don't need sleep, we don't have emotional needs, we don't, this is a myth that I think, is a very convenient myth, actually, for the system, which benefits from us working, 80 hours a week, 28 hours in a row. It's very, very cheap for them. But what if we reclaim that humanity? And I think part of that, beyond just like, actually, I do need to sleep, and actually, things like that, is like, I am on a learning curve, and I think the best educators care about their learners, and love their learners, and want to be a part of moving their learner along that curve. The question of, what if there's somebody who really is kind of not getting it and is behind and needs remediation, sort of a separate topic, and that's not my area of expertise, but I think instead of shaming that person, the goal should be to remediate that person. That's the entire point, is to get them where they need to be. And so how do we do that? And I think, the more we pour shame onto that person, it probably won't help. So just some thoughts.
This was getting me thinking about, best practices or ways to kind of navigate these things. And I think your work and the podcast becomes this sort of external object, or a story that doesn't have to be directly attached to the individual, but somehow you can refer to that story that's out here, this third object, that then is a way to communicate to others the larger kind of issues around shame. And so it's this safe way, potentially, to move that needle, to get yourself out there talking about it without necessarily talking directly about yourself. In terms of applications, I don't know how that works, but in terms of like those interpersonal encounters or those conversations, it's kind of like, oh yeah, this podcast and these stories are out there, and then that can kind of move you into a way of really connecting in an honest way about what's going on.
Do we have time for a couple more? Oh,
can I ask
of
a
course,
question?
yeah.
Thank you so much. This is really such an important topic. I was really interested in what you acknowledged about the use of shame to shape culture, and especially like cultural norms for behavior. And so there is this sort of utility to shame. So I'm wondering if any of the stories that you received had to do with that, where shame, there are some aspects of what shame does for us in medicine and in training that we might want to keep.
Yes, that's such a great question. That is kind of the question, probably, that everybody's thinking. And it's something I've thought a lot about as well. So the first thing I'll say is, like I said, shame is wired into our biology. It is primal. It is actually, at its core, a very pro-social emotion, which probably exists to maintain the integrity of the group. And so I don't think that we should eradicate shame. I don't think that we can eradicate shame. I think the difference is, how do we turn shame into experience that we use as an opportunity for growth and kind of constructive change. I think that's really where it lands. We're never going to get rid of it, but if we can use it to better ourselves and not fester in it and have it be so outsized in our psychology and so corrosive in our culture, you know, and kind of handing it down one generation to the other, I think that is really more the change that we're looking at. So again, not getting rid of, but figuring out how to handle, how to manage, how to use. And the other thing I'll say is, you know, I remember when I was a medical student, like a couple of little medical factoids that are like burned into my brain that I'll never forget for as long as I live, because I was publicly shamed and humiliated in front of a group of my peers when I didn't know the answer. And so the question is like, oh, well, is that good? Like, did it work? Now you remember it. You remember it forever. Flashbulb memory. And I've asked Will about this, who studies shame in learners, and I think what he says is that you may get some of those flashbulb memories from weaponizing shame in a learning setting, but that the benefit of those little flashbulb memories is far outweighed by the risk. And the risk is all of the mental health ramifications that we see: the anxiety, the depression, the imposter syndrome, the perfectionism, there's all of those issues. And it's very hard to learn when you're clenched in that fight or flight state. It's much easier to learn when you're in that relaxed, open, receptive, collaborative, nurturing environment. And so that I'm kind of channeling Will here as I answer that question, but that's probably what I would say. I can imagine doing and saying things that I would be ashamed about. And so again, not eradicating shame. The other thing is, like, what about people who seem to be shameless? So sometimes I was talking about this with another physician friend of mine, like you're the attending and you have a team and there's residents, interns, med students, and often you'll get the people who are sort of like insecure really in their imposter syndrome. But then sometimes you'll get the opposite, where you find somebody who's really overconfident, almost inappropriately so. And so thinking about, well, you know, if you shame them and it doesn't work, like, do you just shame them harder? Or how do you deal with that? And that's a really tricky one to untangle. I think probably my guess is that overconfidence that we're seeing, that Dunning-Kruger, you don't know what you don't know, that probably is some kind of manifestation of an underlying insecurity, would be my guess. This idea of the ignorance-arrogance paradox. And so how do you think about utilizing shame in that setting? I don't have the answer. It does make me wonder, though, and clearly an area that is begging for more research, especially in the context of medical learning.
Hi, my name's Janae. I'm a first-year med student here at Keck. My question was about your thoughts on the use of like social media to have these conversations regarding shame, and I think I imagine it could be a really valuable tool. Are there positives, but are there also potential negatives in using social media to have those conversations?
Yes. There are positives and there are negatives. And, you know, we see that social media is a tremendously powerful tool for building community, starting social movements, things like that. I think social media is also a vector for a lot of badness in society. And I think the reason for that is it's so easy to shame someone on social media. And because it's all virtual, you don't get that immediate feedback that I think we're wired for. So for example, if we're on social media, we're arguing with each other, shaming each other, like we never see each other. We may not even have our real name there on our account. We may just be an egg with a alias. And we say horrible things to each other, and we go to sleep, we don't even care. But now imagine that we're here together, 3D, looking at each other in the eyes, and I say something cruel to you, and then you respond, and there's that sort of, ooh, that hurt. I can feel that energy, and that feeds back, and then I feel like, ooh, I hurt someone. And so that's one reason why social media is really problematic, because the shame runs rampant and you don't get that like very human, energetic feedback of like seeing the effect of your words on someone. And there's a great book about this called The Shame Machine was written by a mathematician, Kathy O'Neill. Yeah, and she talks a lot about shame online and how it works. And some of it's intentional, some of it's actually not intentional, and is driven by algorithms. She struggled with being overweight for a long time, and talks about how her Instagram would feed her all these like weight loss ads and, you know, just these shaming ads, but there was no like evil human behind it. It was just kind of the algorithm that kind of knew what she would click on and capitalize on her shame. So it's a really fascinating topic, thinking about the intersection of shame and the internet, social media, and technology. So check out that book. I think I lost you, but yeah.
Okay, I mean, it's 101. Okay. Let's see. Oh, okay.
Yeah, hello, Stephanie in New York. I'm not sure I understand your question. The question is, how far should one go without falling into the matrix, never to be seen again? I don't know. The answer is hopefully not too far. We started this with a black hole, so hopefully not into the black hole.
Exactly. Well, we have a reception after in the gallery for anyone who can stay with us, and we just want to thank you again.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.